So our main scripture tonight will be 1 Peter chapter 4, and we're gonna cover that. But before we do, I want to set the scene, and this is where I know Roy's been trying to figure out where Batman comes in. But I wanted to start out with a phrase, and I read a concept, and I'm trying to put it in my own words, okay? And then we'll kind of explain where we go, and you'll see how it all ties together. Basically, the phrase is this: the pulse of society can be seen in the stories it tells. The pulse of a society can be seen in the stories it tells. Okay, and we had a great example tonight. I had it in my notes.
Chris, right? Brought it up.
Possibly. I'm forget. Yeah, probably. Yeah. Basically, 3 years ago, even 2 years ago, maybe even a year ago, to see some of the memes that are going around right now, it would have made no sense whatsoever. And the memes I'm talking about are memes about eggs, right? I remember the first meme probably 3-4 months ago that I saw, two guys meeting. It looked like a drug deal going down. Two guys meeting in the driveway, and one opens up and he has all these eggs, and he's trying to make a deal with the eggs and whether they're free-ranging chickens or caged chickens or what that all the different types of eggs. And but if you think about it, Valentine's Day, there's a whole bunch. Instead of getting your Valentine flowers, you now get them eggs. So, but if you think about it, that is a story. Memes are stories, very short version, but memes are stories, and they really show you where society is. It kind of takes the pulse of society. And so, when you start looking at things like that, we can kind of see where our society is, and this is where I'm going to bring in Batman, okay? Do you realize there's probably much more, but as far as the TV and movies go, and that I really recall, there's about 4 different Batman series, okay? Now, most of you probably remember, if you had any TV whatsoever, is watching the I believe it was actually in the 60s is when it came out, but we probably all watched it in the 70s and 80s.
Most of us.
And that's the Batman who you never saw any violence, because when he swung, it was bam, whap, pow, things like that. And if you think about it, it kind of reflected life in America at that time, right? We were very shielded from that. Actually, most of that was before you got to when we could be at war, but we didn't see war. We heard about it, right? We didn't see the gross pictures and things. So Batman was not even really violent. It was just a bunch of words when somebody was supposed to get hit. If you think about it, the Joker and the Penguin, and they were more clownish and fun. I mean, you'd almost say, oh, yeah, go take care of my kid, right? Because that's kind of how they looked. That's kind of how they acted. It was very cartoonish, okay? And then we came into the Batman that I really remember, and it won my heart as a movie that was about superhero. And that was the first real movie there that I remember is, I don't know who did it, but I don't even remember who played Batman. But if you remember, it had a backstory. And for the time, they said it was dark, but it wasn't really dark at all, right? And you saw that you actually saw the characters. They actually did fight. The bad guys were the bad guys, and Batman was definitely the good guy. Okay, and that probably happened in the 90s, I'm thinking when that came out, I'm getting some head shaking of those who love Batman. Okay, and then there was another one that was, and that there was like 2 or 3 movies in there, and they may have been played by different people, but it was really the same producer that produced all those. And they had one with a penguin. And actually, I think there's a couple bad guys in each one of them. And then you had, in the early 2000s, you had the Batman where you got his whole, how he trained in that, yeah, that he trained in the, yeah. And you kind of found out how he got to be so buff and incredibly agile with all his things, and that because the money was always there, and the money always got him his gadgets. But how did he become a fighter? How did he become? And you kind of got that whole backstory, and so that was kind of, it added a whole dimension. In fact, it wasn't even as dark as probably the second series, but it was very much more, it gave Batman a whole life perspective. Not just that his parents died and he has all this money and, you know, he's going to become a superhero. And lately, though, 2010 or whatever, they came out with the Dark Knight series. Okay, and if you think about it, the Dark Knight series, same Batman story, only they really went into more of the villains. And actually some of the villains, they even spun off and got their own movies. Okay, but it really showed, you could almost sympathize with the villains because they were victims. They were either abused or they were good guys. Like some of them, I think Two-Face is a good guy who something happened, he fell in acid or whatever, and he blamed it on Batman. He became a bad guy. And so you almost get the whole thing of it wasn't really their fault, but it's very dark series, and Batman almost becomes a bad guy, right? He's rough and tough and doesn't obey any of the laws, but he's highly committed to doing the right thing still. And the right thing is basically making sure the city's safe, right? And so I bring up that whole thing as how can you take the same story but have really 4 totally different perspectives? Right? They didn't change the story a lot. Some of them added a lot to it. But a lot of it reflected the society. And the society that we live in today is a lot darker society than in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s. We dealt with things back then, but now, especially with a lot of the corruption and stuff that we're seeing come out of the, agencies and government that our parents trusted a lot, you almost can't trust anymore.
Like the news?
Right. Well, even the news and
used to be facts.
But one thing that it shows is that it's a story being told, and the premise nowadays of most stories being told, there's a couple premises and they're not scriptural. And the first one is that everybody's good, they just make bad decisions, right? And even the bad guys, they were victims and just didn't deal with it well, or maybe they weren't victims, but they just made some bad decisions. But we know the Bible talks about something totally different. It says that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. No one is righteous. Righteous means right living. No one is righteous. our righteousness is as filthy rags, is what Jeremiah says. And so those premises that most of our society now lives by is total counterculture to what the Bible teaches. And unfortunately, many people do not even realize that we've totally flip-flopped. And so with that, I want to take a phrase, and we're going to talk about the phrase by looking at 1 Peter 4 and a lot of other scriptures in a different light, okay? And so the phrase is this. Let me make sure I say the right one first. God will make your life better. How many have heard that? Yeah? And I believe that. God will make your life better. But depending on what your viewpoint is and what perspective you come out of is how you think about that. Because a lot of people say, when you say, God will make your life better, what do you think of?
Most people probably think of wealth,
Okay, wealth,
money.
right? God's going to give you everything you need and more.
Troubles are over.
Our troubles are over, right? And we have this, and I think, not because necessarily pastors want to, but when they say, or Christians say, God will make your life better, people hear it as, oh, he's going to help me out of all my troubles. And then when you start following Christ, and that doesn't happen, it makes a lot of people turn away. But saying God will make your life better, like I said at the beginning, it's a phrase I do believe is true. I think it just has to be explained a lot better, because when really what it means is when you're going through all the hard things, when you're going through all the struggles, and by the way, you may have more because you're a follower of Christ, God will be there and he'll help you through it. And that's really a true statement. But most of the time when we hear it, we think, oh, my struggles and my trials and my addictions and my habits and my dysfunction will all get better. Okay? I like the phrase that not only will God help you in life, but God helps you live better. Is really because he begins to change you on the inside. And so with all that, let's read 1 Peter 4. We're just going to start out with verses 1 through 19. Tina, do you,
You should read it, because I won't be able to hear.
Oh, okay. Okay, I guess I get to read it. So it says, so then, since Christ suffered physical pain, you must arm yourselves with the same attitude he had and be ready to suffer too. For if you have suffered physically for Christ, you have finished with sin. You won't spend the rest of your lives chasing your own desires, but you will be anxious to do the will of God. You have had enough in the past of the evil things that godless people enjoy, their immorality and lust, their feasting and drunkenness and wild parties, and their terrible worship of idols. Of course, your former friends are surprised when you no longer plunge into the flood of wild and destructive things they do. so they slander you. But remember that they will have to face God, who stands ready to judge everyone, both the living and the dead. That is why good news was preached to those who are now dead. So although they were destined to die, like all people, they now live forever with God in the Spirit. The end of the world is coming soon. Therefore, be earnest and disciplined in your prayers. Most important of all, continue to show deep love for each other, for love covers a multitude of sins. Cheerfully share your home with those who need a meal or a place to stay. So that's the first half of the chapter. And as we've talked several times, one of the main things that Peter covers in his first letter is suffering. And he covers that a lot. We see it in a lot of the different chapters. And so what we're going to do, I wanted to kind of give you a glasses to look at this through. Okay? And so I'm not going to read all the scriptures, but I'm going to tell you where I'm going to kind of go through this. Basically, a covenant defines the terms of a relationship. A covenant defines the terms of a relationship. Okay? The promises, the commitments, it's a contract. And so the key concept to understanding the Bible is understanding the covenants. If you don't understand the covenants, you will never understand the Bible. For instance, and we've talked about this before, we have an Old Testament and a New Testament. It really stands for an Old Covenant and a New Covenant. Testament is just another word for covenant, okay? So if you mix up the Old Testament and the New Testament, you'll be very confused and you think God is a psycho. Why is that? Because the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, is all about a covenant between God and Abraham, which it eventually becomes Israel. So it's a covenant between God and starts out with a person and becomes a nation. Okay? The New Testament or the New Covenant is about a covenant between God and believers. Okay? And so in the Old Covenant, you have these 10 laws, and then you have another 600 and some laws, and there's some weird stuff in there, okay? But the New Covenant between God and us, believers, followers, basically our main law is to love each other as Christ loved us, okay? And it's totally different, because if you look at the Old Testament, you'll see some of the things that God said for the nation of Israel to do. And you may say, because we look through modern day society, you may say, oh, well, that wasn't very loving. God's not, well, first off, that wasn't the covenant we're under now. God's going to act differently, not because he's different, but God's going to act differently because it's a different covenant. And part of that covenant that was God created with Israel, part of that covenant was, if you do this, I will do that. If you do this, I will bless you. But if you choose to not do this, then you will reap what's going to happen, and they're not blessings, okay? They're curses, basically. And God dealt with people differently because it was a different covenant. Now we're under what believers call the blood. We're under the blood of Jesus. Jesus died for us, and we are under a totally different covenant, Okay, really the covenant of love. Okay, but love is not based on what society thinks love is. And you can see that very, very clearly now. Okay? For instance, society would almost say, if God is love, love is God. Right? But that's not what it is at all. Okay? Love, a lot of times, is hard. Love is discipline. Love is speaking the truth when it's hard and people don't want to hear it. Love is taking a stand. There's lots of things about love where if you talk to people who are flooded with the society and how the society thinks, it is, well, let's just face it. And I know this is very political, but it's a political issue that is really a spiritual issue that people think is political. And that's this, with the immigrants, okay? We are supposed to be, as believers, we're supposed to be open-armed to immigrants. I believe that 100%. We're supposed to love people, even if they come from someplace else. And especially those who are struggling. However, what do you do with somebody who's an illegal immigrant? I think we can care for them, but once again, it's illegal. They need to go through the proper process of becoming a citizen. And I've said this many times, I'll say it again. If you come into our country illegally, that's just the beginning of many, many things that you do illegally. Say, well, that's not necessary. They're good people. Yes, they may be great people. But guess what? If you go across our borders illegally, what happens? You have to drive illegally. That means you don't have the right insurance. And somebody said, well, yeah, your car can have insurance. That's not the right insurance. The insurance, I know because I have a son that just started driving. Our insurance went way up. We kept the same cars. It wasn't the cars, it's because we added a driver, and the driver has to be insured. And so that's just one. You can go over and over and over about things that they have to do illegally. Okay? So, how do you love the immigrant? We can definitely help them, and we've helped as a group. People who are illegal, people who are legal. Okay? We love, we care, but I believe there's a process, and we should encourage them in the right process. Okay? That doesn't mean we don't love. Love just looks a little bit different. People like to use, well, Jesus turned over the tables. Right, because he was love and loving his Father's house and loving the people who wanted to come to his Father's house, turning over the tables on the money exchangers that were right there, that were cheating people and basically taking advantage of those who are coming hundreds of miles from every direction to make sacrifices and to worship, was not okay with him. And so sometimes we have to stand up. Chloe just wanted to be in the video.
You'll be hearing her.
So where I want to go with this, and we may not get a lot of the scriptures I wanted to get done, but I wanted to lay a foundation for covenants. So in Genesis 9, like I said, you can write these down and look them up. In Genesis 9, we find actually two covenants there, both of them with Noah. And it's after Noah gets off the ark, and him and his family basically sacrifice and worship God. And God gives them a covenant. Basically, it says something like this: never again will I flood the earth. I want you to go out and multiply and take dominion over the earth, almost like what we heard him tell Adam and Eve. Be fruitful and multiply, take dominion, take care of things. And so Noah's covenant was a covenant of mercy. Noah's covenant was a covenant of mercy. And I'm going to cover several different covenants that we see in the Old Testament. I talked about Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve was a covenant of freedom. You may not realize this, but God basically gave them the freedom to do whatever. They only had one thing that they weren't supposed to do, and they took the freedom to do that too. And so Adam and Eve had a covenant of freedom. We have Abraham. Abraham had a covenant of promise. Promise to be his people, to become a nation, and promise for land. Moses had the covenant of law. And basically that covenant said, you follow the law, and God said, I will be your God. I will lead you and guide you. David, God made a covenant with David, and the covenant with David that he made was a covenant of kingship, that David would always have somebody in his line that was a king, and we know now that somebody was Jesus. Now there's one other covenant that was in Genesis 9 that had to do with Noah, but basically what God said, it's kind of a weird thing, but he said that you weren't to drink the blood of animals or strangle animals. You had to basically drain them, okay? And that was tucked in there. And so I wanted to bring that covenant out because in Acts, let me make sure I get Acts 15, 19 through 21, that's when the council met, because Paul came to the Jewish council and said, hey, all these Gentiles are getting saved, and there's a lot of confusion about what they're supposed to do to be believers. Do they have to become fully Jewish and follow everything that we do to follow Jesus? And so what the council said, after talking about it and praying about it, they said, it's good, as we've talked, we believe this is where the Holy Spirit's taking us. And he says, basically, don't be immoral. But then he says this. They say, and don't eat meat that were sacrificed to idols, and don't basically drink blood or eat meat that's been strangled. Well, where's that? I'll tell you what they mean. First off, being sexually immoral, we all understand, why he was telling everybody has to do that if you're a follower of Christ. Number two, that don't sacrifice or don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. That was so that Gentile believers would not offend Jewish believers. Okay, so that was an act of love to say, because it was very offensive to the Jewish believers. But what's this blood thing? Well, once again, it goes back to Genesis 9. And you say, well, that's the Old Testament. What does that make a difference for? This is the important thing. In John 6, Jesus basically takes the cup of wine at the Last Supper. And what did he say? This is my blood. Okay? What Jesus was basically saying is the covenant of blood. Because almost every culture has something that if you drink the blood, it's life, it makes you a warrior, you take the power of, there's all sorts of different little culture, but different cultures all had something about drinking blood, okay? But as followers, Jesus is saying, look, the only blood that's going to give you power is my blood, eternal life. And that's not that we drink Jesus' blood, but we drink the representation of his blood. And that's we do when we take communion. So to wrap up talking about the covenant, it's probably easier for me to read this. Noah, Abraham, David all received their covenant at an altar. Noah built an altar. David was at an altar. Abraham was at an altar, and they received their covenant. Moses was on a mountain. Of course, Adam and Eve in a garden. Just like a bride and groom come to the altar to lay down their lives separately. Okay? Where do they do that? They do that at the altar most of the time. Right? That's the significance. They sacrifice oneness to embrace new life together. We meet God at the altar. What does that mean? It may not be an altar in a church. It may not be an altar in a building. But we go and we have to come to a place where we sacrifice. We lay down our oneness, just like the two become one. Okay, we lay down our oneness for new life with Christ. And so, we're in covenant with Jesus because Ephesians is very, very clear that Christ is the bridegroom and we are the bride. Right? He uses that analogy for the church. So we meet God at the altar. We lay down our oneness to embrace new life. And get this, what's in our new life? The freedom that was in the covenant with Adam and Eve. The mercy that was in the covenant with Noah. Right? We have a different law, but it has the law, right? The law of love that was in the covenant with Moses. And of course, we get King Jesus, which was in the covenant with David. So now we have a perfect law, the law of love. We become part of God's people, right? Because Abraham's promise was to be a people and a nation. And in Ephesians it says we are a new people. Doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or a Gentile. Doesn't matter what color, creed, what nation you came from. We're all one family now. And so all the covenants that we see in the Old Testament, and if you begin to read the Old Testament, looking at those covenants and what covenant they were under, and then look towards the New Testament, and Jesus is that new covenant. And we have the perfection of all those in one. And so when looking at that, if you look at 1 Peter, and especially 1 Peter 4, with the glasses of it's a covenant, and I'm going to call it this not because I've ever heard it called this before, but I think it just illustrates what it is. That Peter gives us the covenant of suffering. The covenant of suffering. Okay? None of us want to suffer. None of us like suffering. But I found I have about 10 scriptures here, and we're not going to read them tonight because I think we're going to continue this next week and do a lot of the scriptures. This was, we did all the pre-stuff tonight and kind of, I wanted to set the stage. But let me give you the 4 things that the covenant of suffering helps us with. And we already read some in 1 Peter 4. What we read was, we're finished with sin. That's number 1, finished with sin. And you say, how does that work? I don't know how it works, but it's part of the covenant. The first thing that Peter says is this: so then, since Christ suffered physical pain, you must arm yourselves with the same attitude he had and be ready to suffer too. For if you have suffered physically for Christ, you have finished with sin. So the first part of the covenant is when we suffer for Christ, we're finished with sin. Number two, we identify with Christ. Identify with Christ. Number three, it's a testing and a growing process. And I don't just have one scripture for each one of these. I have multiple scriptures.
You said last one?
Testing and growing. And the last one, number 4, is reward. Is reward. So finished with sin, identify with Christ, testing and growing, and reward. Those are the 4 parts. You can say they're 4 benefits, but they're the 4 essential elements that I see that suffering with Christ brings. And like I said, I have several scriptures on each one. A lot of them found in 1 Peter chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. But we have James, we have Jesus talking about it, we have it all over the New Testament. And so that's why I say it's kind of a covenant of suffering. And I think it's very important because most of us would like to become victims now. Because if you're a victim, you don't have to take responsibility for what you do. You can just say, well, I made a bad choice. It was a mistake. But Jesus promised that we would suffer. He said he was persecuted, and if you follow him, you'll be persecuted as well. And so, this doesn't answer the question, why do bad things happen to good people? But this does hopefully help when we start looking at life is better with God. Not because you get more money, not because you're more blessed, not because you don't have to go through things, but because when you go through things, there's a covenant that we make with Christ, and it gives us benefits.